Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 284, A New King. Catherine was only 15 when Pope Clement's unexpected death entirely destroyed her political existence. Knowing she was regarded as a poor excuse for a princess by the ever-cast conscience French, lacking any foreign dynastic support, and without any powerful French connections of her own, she must have felt incredibly vulnerable. If she had been beautiful, perhaps she could have evoked the love of the common people. But her heavy cheeks and bulging eyes were stubborn features that could not be coaxed away by makeup. Her Italian fashions and other hints of her origins only served to remind people of past French military failures in Italy and a lost opportunity of allying France with a superior bride. Besides, when the French were not busy imitating the Italians in art and culture or occupying their country, they tended to despise them as money-grabbing opportunists who would slip a knife between a man's shoulder blades as soon as his back was turned. It is unlikely that the Venetian ambassador exaggerated excessively when he wrote that the marriage, quote, displeases the entire nation, end quote. Catherine, above all, was a practical person. She knew that she could neither change her birth nor her face, but she could use the experiences of her past and her formidable willpower and intelligence to overcome her present misfortunes. Recognizing that she was unpopular, she decided to cultivate the most important people at court. The first and most obvious would be the king. Fortunately, Catherine seems to have, from the start, evoked protective feelings from her father-in-law. Ever quick to see what made people happy, she had no trouble at all identifying Francis's weakness. The king put pleasure before almost anything else. He was frequently found in the company of a beautiful group of courtly ladies, referred to as La Petite Bande. Membership to this group required several traits: a quick wit, a willingness to take bawdy jokes, courage on horseback, and above all, good looks. Catherine found herself admitted, though she was decidedly lacking in the final element. Her job became keeping Francis happy. She was terrific at it, and proved quite adept at performing the latest dances. Catherine is even credited with having brought the side saddle to France. Her conversational skills, more learned than most girls of her age, amused Francis immensely. Catherine also appealed to the king's sister Marguerite, now the Queen of Navarre, for friendship and guidance. Marguerite was one of the cleverest women at court. She also supported religious reform, certainly much more than her brother did. Marguerite had a ton of influence at court and over her brother, so Catherine was fortunate to be taken under her wing. Despite all these inroads, the one person Catherine did not seem to be able to grow closer to was her own husband. Henry treated his wife with civility, but his indifference to her was plain for all to see. Henry resented his father's choice of bride. He did not find Catherine attractive and bristled at her lack of royal blood. Plus, with Clement dead, there was no dowry. From Henry's perspective, Catherine no longer brought anything to the table at all. Oh, how wrong he was. The biggest problem was that Catherine now found herself in a growing rivalry with Henry's favorite, Diane de Poitiers. If you remember from last time, Diane was the woman who had endeared herself to Henry when he was a child by showing him kindness on the day of the prisoner exchange. Now, Diane was 19 years older than Henry at this point, though she was still considered a beauty. Diane had been widowed since 1531. While they were not openly having an affair during the period before Francis's death, there is little doubt among scholars that by 1532-33, Henry had become completely infatuated with Diane. The biggest issue here is that Diane's relationship with Henry would create massive problems for Catherine moving forward. In 1536, Francis declared war on the emperor again, and he took his sons with him on campaign. While on campaign, on August the 2nd, despite the immensely hot and oppressive weather, the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, played a vigorous game of tennis with one of his gentlemen. After the game, he felt hot and breathless. Sending his secretary, an Italian count named Sebastian de Montillet, for a glass of freezing water to cool himself, he collapsed immediately after drinking it. Not long afterwards, the prince developed a high fever and experienced difficulty breathing. He died in the early morning hours of the 10th of August at Tournon. The king, not near his son when he passed, was heard later to cry out, quote, "My God, I know I must accept with patience whatever it be thy will to send me. But from whom, if not from thee, ought I hoped for strength and resignation?" End quote. With the sudden and unexpected death of the Dauphin, Henry and Catherine were pressed into the limelight. They were now the future king and queen of France. Both were 17 years old. Unfortunately, Catherine found herself in her new position and almost immediately under threat. Imperial ambassadors accused her of poisoning the former Dauphin so that her husband might be king. This sounds ridiculous to us, because it is. But Italians were assumed to be all experts in the art of poison. Hence, to many in France, Catherine was a natural suspect. Luckily for her, Francis gave the wild allegations no credence at all. Still, it was a sign of things to come. But the real problem wasn't baseless poisoning accusations. The real problem was that Catherine and Henry had been married for 3 years, and yet there had been no sign of her becoming pregnant. Making matters worse, in 1537, Henry got the wife of one of his grooms pregnant, or at least Henry assumed the child was his. This would mean that the problem was Catherine. Evidently, Henry was more than capable of fathering a child. If Catherine could not produce an heir, there was every reason to believe she might go the path of another Catherine, Catherine of Aragon, and find herself in the proverbial royal dustbin. Catherine's endurance faced another test, as Diane de Poitiers became more assiduous in her attentions to Henry. In 1538, a truce was declared between France and the Empire, encouraged by Pope Paul III, who wanted Francis and Charles to unite in a campaign against the ever-threatening Ottoman Turks. When Henry returned from the war, Diane, now 38 years old, found him more confident and no longer the timid boy she had been coaching for years. She showered Henry, the Dauphin, with compliments on his military prowess, knowing that the moment had arrived for her to take possession of him completely. Casting aside any platonic ideals with which she had fended him off forever, she decided to become involved with him romantically and become effectively the mistress to the future king. Aided by Anne de Montmorency, who offered the couple the use of his castle for their trysts, Diane allowed Henry to become her lover. It's not known exactly when this happened, but certainly by some point in 1538, the two were having an affair. Catherine knew she would not last long now unless she produced a child, and unbeknownst to her, a campaign to replace her was already underway. But then, in an odd twist of fate, Diane de Poitiers decided to throw her weight and influence behind Catherine. She was worried about her own position. There was no reason to believe that a new young bride might be quite as willing to indulge Henry's affair with Diane as Catherine had been. In Catherine, Diane had resignation. So she decided she would not risk a throw of the dice. Diane would back Catherine. Of course, the final decision rested with the king. And knowing that he was, however unwillingly, having to consider a new wife for his son, Catherine gambled everything on a show of feminine submission to the man who liked to call himself, quote, the first gentleman of France, end quote, which is a ridiculous title given his behavior, but anyway. Throwing herself at his feet, sobbing, Catherine told Francis that she accepted that she must stand aside for a bride who would bear Henry children, begging only to be allowed to remain in France and serve the fortunate lady who might replace her in whatever lowly capacity the king might permit. Her sorrow and humility were so touching that the king found himself her champion against his own better judgment. Unable to stand the sight of any woman in tears, Francis, profoundly moved, declared, quote, my child, it is God's will that you should be my daughter and the wife of the Dauphin. So be it, end quote. It was a reprieve, but everyone knew a temporary one. And so the king had spoken. Catherine would remain the Dauphine. Even Henry began treating his wife with some affection, realizing he had no option. He, after all, needed an heir as well. Her enemies silenced for a moment, Catherine turned first to traditional medicine with almost no success. Prayers and offerings to God were constantly on her lips. Diane, for her part, gave her advice, potions, sent the Dauphin off to do his duty conscientiously and regularly by sleeping with his wife. He followed Diane's orders, but with little enthusiasm. Catherine pored over old medical texts, anything that she could find, even references to ancient magic and pagan remedies. Some of these were borderline dangerous and ridiculous, but Catherine followed them anyway. She drank large contents of mule's urine, and the current wisdom being that it would provide a primitive form of inoculation against sterility. She was given clear instructions, though, not to go near the mule. Okay. The astrologers were also consulted, and Catherine faithfully followed their every instruction, but no child appeared. Finally, exasperated, Catherine became convinced that she was sexually incompetent and committing some sort of an error. Whatever Diane was doing with her husband, she had to try to do the same. It is said that the young woman ordered holes to be bored through the floor so that she could look down into the bedchamber where her husband and Diane spent their passionate nights together. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting begged her not to go through this agonizing process, but she would hear no argument, and instead went to watch Henry make love to his mistress. What she had seen suggested to her that she and her husband did something different when they lay together. And so at last a doctor named Jean Fanrel was called. He examined the couple and found that their reproductive organs both carried slight physical abnormalities. The sensible doctor counseled a method that might overcome the problem, though we don't know what that was. The couple were told what to do, and Henry performed his duty. Their joy was obvious to all when in the early summer of 1543, Catherine became pregnant. On January the 19th, 1544, she went into labor, and everyone was relieved when she delivered a healthy baby, and a boy at that. The happy couple named the child Francis. For the aging king, the symbolism was obvious. Whatever cure Dr. Farnell had prescribed for the Dauphin and his wife, it worked spectacularly. Over the following 12 years, Catherine would give birth to another 9 children. Catherine's good health was not, however, inherited by her children, with the notable exception of their daughter Margot, who enjoyed good health. Her siblings were, by and large, sickly. Of the 7 children, who would survive infancy. 6 suffered from weak lungs and most likely tuberculosis. Francois, Charles Maximilian, and Edouard Alexandre were also prone to septic sores, infections, and as they grew older, fits of dementia that implied genetically inherited syphilis from their grandfather, Lorenzo II de' Medici. In many ways, the dreadful health of the royal children, especially the boys, was one of the major factors that forced Catherine to maintain her central role in governing France, even once her sons were mature. At the birth of her first son, Catherine immediately went from being barely tolerated to widely celebrated. Oddly, if anything, Diane's influence over Henry grew as Catherine gave birth to child after child. Catherine, in the end, was forced to concede that there were 3 people in this marriage. Now, what happens next is kind of interesting, and it has a lot to do with court intrigue, so I'll get into it in a little bit, but essentially there's 2 court favorites. There's Diane, who's Henry's court favorite, and then there's Madame d'Etampes, who is favorite to the king, Francis. Catherine tried to navigate between the 2 as best she could, even though their quiet rivalry had sort of blown up into open hostility. At first, the 2 sort of had a mild dislike for each other, but over time, this grew into open hatred, mostly driven by the fact that Madame d'Etampes really started to fear at one point that eventually Francis was going to die, and that was becoming increasingly clear as the years went on, meaning that she was almost certainly going to be replaced by Diane, and so it was sort of a jealousy thing. By 1540, as Francis began to weaken from excesses that stemmed from his youth, taunts from d'Etampes about, quote-unquote, the old lady, as she called Henry's mistress, grew louder and louder. She claimed to have been born on her rival's wedding day, though she was actually only 9 years younger than Diane. Rumors about Henry's favorite were enlarged, and any differences between them was eagerly seized upon. D'Etampes took a keen interest in the new religion, while Diane detested the reform movement. Essentially, the 2 would just sort of pick opposite sides of every issue that they could, maybe regardless as to their personal beliefs. The positions between the 2 parties at court polarized progressively over time. Madame d'Etampes championed the king's son, Charles, who was his favorite but youngest. She planned to make him powerful enough to protect her when the king died. After the emperor and Francis had met in Nice in 1538 and settled a 10-year truce, the king, egged on by his younger favorite, entered into talks with his erstwhile enemy about a marriage between Charles and the emperor's daughter, Mary. Francis was led to believe that Milan would be her dowry, which infuriated Henry, his son, who considered that duchy rightfully his. Montmorency, who had promoted peace between the 2 rulers, found himself disgraced and banished from court when the emperor proceeded to go back on his earlier promises by installing his son, later Philip II of Spain, who we're going to get to soon in the podcast, as Duke of Milan in 1540. The relationship between Henry and Charles, the 2 remaining royal brothers, which could never really have been described as cozy or close, now became a dangerous feud. Each party sort of led on by these 2 rival women, Diane de Poitiers and the Duchess of Etampes, and enjoyed considerable backing by the princesses' respective followers. Henry always felt jealous of his father's clear love for his younger brother, and he may have even resented the fact that Charles had not been forced to endure the appalling years of captivity in Spain. Now he was witness to quite blatant efforts by Charles to carve out a strong base for himself as a feudal lord, so powerful that he would in fact represent a major threat to Henry when Henry became king. Now, after the emperor had made a fool of Francis with his promise of marriage in Milan for Prince Charles, the king had no choice but to go to war with his old enemy. The brothers now competed with each other for military glory. In 1542, Charles took Luxembourg with little effort. But when he heard that Henry was preparing to attack Perpignan, he hastened to join him and share in the military success. Perpignan proved impossible to take, and during Charles's absence, the imperialists recaptured Luxembourg, as the rivalry between the two princes now exacerbated France's declining position. France continued to suffer, steadily running out of allies. Henry begged his father to allow Montmorency to return with his undoubted military skills, which might help France recover the initiative. But the king denied his son's request. Nevertheless, despite his father, Henry fought with notable valor and distinction, but was powerless to do anything to prevent further imperial successes. The emperor's troops proceeded to invade Champagne and directly threaten Paris. But as just so often happened in his reign, just as Charles V was about to destroy his old enemy, we know, his troops deserted him because, as we know, they hadn't been paid. Perpetual problem for Charles V. Both parties, exhausted, now negotiated a settlement, and the peace treaty of Crépy was signed on the 18th of September in 1544. This treaty could probably be described as the maybe second dumbest act of Francis's reign, second only to being captured in battle, because it incorporated a marriage between Charles of France and either a daughter of the emperor or one of his brother's daughters. If it were the emperor's own daughter, then he would bestow the Netherlands upon her as her dowry. If it was her niece, then she would receive Milan as her wedding gift. In return, Francis agreed to give his son several of France's most important duchies, Angoulême, Bourbon, and Orléans. Now, why was this a bad deal? Well, because he was basically dividing France in half between his two sons. Henry was apoplectic when he heard the details, for though the succession had been assured thanks to the birth of his son, now Charles, his younger brother, would be just as powerful as he was. And worse still, he would have the backing of the emperor. The House of Valois would be effectively split in half. Doubtless, this is exactly what Charles V intended, and Francis just didn't see it. The country was only now just starting to emerge as a national entity, leaving behind the old factional feudalism that had just bedeviled France for so long. Henry understood, as did many other outraged members of the nobility, that the Treaty of Crépy contained all the ingredients to revive this dangerous situation. Having been obliged to sign this treaty out of, quote, fear and reverence for my father, end quote, Henry proceeded to write a secret denunciation of the pact, which gave away inalienable crown properties. 3 members of his closest entourage, Francois of Guise, Antoine de Bourbon, and Bourbon's brother, the Count d'Anlay, witnessed the document. Now, the Duchess of Estampes was triumphant at this point. She had manipulated the increasingly decrepit Francis, possibly using treachery. She had skillfully undermined the Dauphin and his party, and this gave her every reason to hope that she might be secure after Francis's death, after all. Although there is no direct evidence against her, it is thought that the Duchess was passing secrets to the Emperor, and therefore almost certainly guilty of treason. She left for Brussels with Queen Eleanor and Charles to celebrate the signing of the treaty. The cool relationship between Francis and his oldest son, Henry, worsened. Henry rarely now saw his father, and absented himself from court as much as he could. In revenge, Francis ostentatiously lavished gifts and love and pride, all on Charles, his youngest son. Finally, in the fall of 1544, King Francis banished Diane de Poitiers from court after constant pestering from his own favorite. Now, as an aside, some of these court politics issues may seem a little bit, mundane to be covering in the podcast, but they actually a lot of times and they will in this case, have major foreign policy and domestic ramifications. We're covering them now in the podcast and didn't episodes before because, frankly, we just didn't have the information. It's extremely likely that there was a lot of court intrigue in the court of, let's say, Charlemagne. We just don't have the sources to substantiate it. What happens starting in the early modern period is our number of sources increases dramatically. That's really what drives the change in the narrative. It's not so much that I've decided this part of history is more interesting. It's just that the number of sources goes up exponentially. All right, so getting back to the story, after Diane was banished from court, Henry moped around a bit, but Catherine was no doubt secretly a little gleeful. But Henry didn't have much time to mope around because there was still ongoing wars and conflicts going on. As you will recall, back in the reign of Henry VIII, the English captured the city of Boulogne. And so Charles, the youngest son, and Henry decided to go campaigning in the Boulogne area, trying to evict the English who had captured the town back in 1544. At this time, you could actually finally start to see relations between Henry and his younger brother Charles getting a little bit better. Francis, anxious to keep busy in order to avoid dwelling on his dwindling health, had actually gone with his sons on campaign. That was a little unusual for this period. Henry and his brother had hardly addressed one word to each other since the Peace of Crepy had been signed. But gradually, a general sort of fraternal spirit started to emerge during the military operations, maybe a sense of camaraderie. And then in the month of August 1544, plague, this is the recurring waves of bubonic plague that come back every 8 to 10 years, broke out in the vicinity of Boulogne. On September the 6th, Charles and some of his young nobles came upon a house where all the inhabitants had recently died of the disease. Charles, in what could only be described as a colossal blunder or maybe an excess of youthful confidence, decided to go in and have a look. He was urged not to, but laughing, the young prince commented, quote, "Never yet has a son of France died of the plague," end quote. And with that, he and his friends went inside and they started to tear the place apart, allegedly pillow fighting at one point. And he was right. Never yet, to this point, had a son of France died of the plague. By evening, he began to feel sick. 3 days later, Charles was dead. Never yet. The Peace of Crepy was now totally obsolete. Henry was now going to be the undisputed ruler of a united France. Henry, going forward, refused to attend council meetings. He now said he didn't wish to be tainted by his father's failed legacy when he passed. Finally, after long last, and if we're being honest, a lot of wasted money and a lot of wasted lives, in June of 1546, France and England signed a peace treaty giving back Boulogne for the price of 2 million écus. With a natural sense of relief, Catherine and Henry went on their first official progress together that fall. Catherine had given birth to 2 children in the span of just 14 months and fell ill while the couple was traveling. Henry stayed by her side as she recuperated, an indication of just how much their relationship had changed. Fortunately for France, she did recover. Then, in February of 1547, word reached France that Henry VIII, King of England, had died. Francis was devastated by the news. He knew he likely did not have much longer to go himself. He could no longer ride a horse and could barely walk. By late February, he was bedridden. The most likely cause of his final sickness was probably gonorrhea, which, if left untreated, would lead to bladder and urinary tract infections. Catherine visited her dying benefactor shortly thereafter, on March the 20th, and she could tell the end was near. Then, on March the 31st, 1547, the king who had started his reign so auspiciously, only to see it end so badly, breathed his last. Certainly, both Henry and Catherine had learned a lot from Francis and his reign, and as the new king and queen of France, they were determined not to repeat his mistakes. As always, before our next episode, if you're interested in additional content, check out the links in the show notes, links to the website there, and links to the Patreon, Western Civ 2.0. You can get the whole story of Western Civ in better detail and better audio quality all over again. Getting into the Romans once more, everyone's favorite classical civilization.